But on the other hand, when people say the internal evidence is so weighty, it outweighs all the external evidence. Think about the huge inconsistency on that issue, okay? The huge inconsistency is that the internal evidence is so weighty, and yet despite the internal evidence being so weighty for an early date, the majority of the early church missed the internal evidence. We're not talking about just like 51% of the church here. We're talking about out of the access of the resources we have, both historical and into modern day. We're talking the vast majority of the church has dated the book of Revelation late. Okay? So if the internal evidence was so weighty and so clear and so obviously pre-70 AD, why is it that so many people missed it?
This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Bible Sojourner. It's great to have you. Today, we are going to talk about the date of the book of Revelation. And why is that important, you may ask? Well, that's a fair question. As you may have noticed, if you have listened to the podcast or watched the videos for any amount of time, one of the things that I've been talking about periodically is really the revival of postmillennialism. And postmillennialism, as a eschatological system, relies heavily on preterism. Now, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And in the world of eschatology, in the study of what happens at the end, this discussion of what happens in the future, the end times, all of that, our expectation about what happens in the future is potentially limited by our view of whether or not Revelation has already come to pass, or the things in the book of Revelation have already taken place. So if you believe Revelation is prophecy, as a lot of people do, now we'll talk more about that in a second, but if you believe that Revelation is prophecy, you're basically saying it's prophecy about something that has already taken place, or it's prophecy about something that is in the future that has not yet taken place, okay? And interestingly enough, the date of the book of Revelation actually heavily impacts that, because in some viewpoints, which we'll talk about, preterism, if Revelation is written after 70 AD, which is the historic position of the church, then it de facto cannot be prophesying about the things that happened in 70 AD. And everyone admits that. And so that's why this is a pretty contentious issue. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to look at that issue, and we'll talk about the evidence as we present it, external, internal. It'll be really fun. So let's get going with that. All right, so when we talk about this issue, dating the book of Revelation, the first thing to understand is there are basically two options. There have been others thrown out there over time, but two options, kind of lead the pack, as it were, and that's what we would refer to as the early date or the late date. The early date is associated with Nero, and that would be about 64 AD to 68 AD, somewhere in there. And the most prominent individual who has put forward that position would be Kenneth Gentry. Recently, within the last couple decades, he's written a lot on that issue, and he's the one that everyone looks to as kind of the authoritative position on that. And he specifically dates the book of Revelation within a very tiny window, because he says Revelation is dealing with prophetic events about the death of Nero, the destruction of Jerusalem, the engagement of the Jewish war in the spring of AD 67. So he's basically saying that the book has to be written between 64 and 67 AD, because you have to have the beginning of Nero's persecution, which starts in 64 AD, and then you also have to have it written before the destruction of Jerusalem and the engagement with the Jews in 67 AD. So 64 to 67, very specific during that time period. And some people will stretch that out to 68. In fact, in some points of church history, 68 and 69 AD were put forward as possible dates for the early date of Revelation, and we'll talk about that briefly. But that's known as the early date, okay? And then the late date is what's known as the date that associates with Domitian. And so Nero is one, Roman ruler that the early date is associated with, because he persecutes the church. He's, very beast-like in his character, all sorts of things like that. And then you have the Domitian date, which is at the end of the reign of Domitian, another Roman emperor, and that would date to 95 or 96 AD because Domitian is killed in 96 AD. And so those two dates are the ones that are typically put forward by scholars. And if you read commentaries or articles on the dating of Revelation, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find a date associated with Nero, the early date, around 64 to 67 AD, 68. Some people will say 69, but very rare nowadays. And then you also have the late date, which by and large, 95 to 96 AD. Now, some people will even push it back further, but they're really beyond I think, the scope of what we're trying to talk about. We are assuming people are going to take Revelation at face value, that the Apostle John himself wrote the book. And so we're going to assume the testimony of Scripture is true. Some people will say, oh, there were revisions and things like that, but that's typical liberal scholarship, and we're not interested in talking about that. So now we're going to talk about some definitions. And so this is where people could get confused, but I really want to try to make this understandable for people. So when we talk about eschatology, usually we throw it into three broad camps. Now there are sub-camps within these, and nobody believes the exact same thing, or very few people believe the exact same thing within camps oftentimes. But there are three broad eschatological camps. You have the premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial viewpoints. And there are ranges within those camps, but the basic core of those viewpoints are associating Christ's return with Revelation 20. Like when Revelation 20 talks about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, how are we to associate that with the return of Christ? That's how these views are associated. That's how they're named. Is premillennial means that Christ's return happens prior to Revelation 20, and that return of Christ to establish his kingdom. So that's a premillennial view. The postmillennial viewpoint, which is kind of the opposite of that, is that Christ returns after either a real millennium, but really nobody in the postmillennial camp believes that anymore. So they take a figurative millennium, and then after that figurative millennium is over, Christ returns. And a big difference between, and that's very similar to amillennial. Amillennial, I mean, the name means that there's no millennium, but that's kind of unfair to them. They would call it more of a realized millennium, meaning that it's a spiritualized existence. So postmillennialism and amillennialism are very similar. It's often just a difference of what the expectation is in this life. Many, if not most, postmillennialists would hold to a idea of marching through history where the world gets better and better over time. And eventually, all the world will be brought under subjugation of Christ, and then Christ will return. Amillennialists normally don't think that that's necessary. They say Christ could return anytime. And so there is a lot of overlap between amillennial and postmillennial viewpoints. There's just, on the details, there's about how current history works out, there's some differences on that. So amillennial and postmillennial viewpoints believe that Christ returns at some point after an indefinite period of time. Premillennialism, they spiritualize the millennium. Premillennialism believes that Christ will return prior to the establishment of the millennium, prior to the establishment of the kingdom. Okay, so those are typically how we define those viewpoints, those camps. Now, within Revelation and understanding the book of Revelation, there are actually a variety of interpretive approaches that correlate. They're not the exact same, but correlate to those eschatological viewpoints. So the first one, which we talked about, would be Preterism. Okay, so I mentioned that previously, but Preterism is basically the belief that all or most of the prophecies in Revelation have already been fulfilled. Particularly the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD is the fulfillment of what a lot of Revelation is talking about. Now, that's not denying that there are symbolic elements in Revelation. Okay, I think many preterists would hold to that. But a lot of Revelation, at least with regard to prophecy, has been fulfilled. And again, there are variations. Some say there still remains future. For example, Revelation 21 and 22, some say are already fulfilled. Some say that it remains to be fulfilled when Christ returns. That's talking about the new heavens and new earth. So there's variation among the preterist camps for how to understand that. Alternatively, a futurist in approaching Revelation, a futurist says that the prophecies that Revelation give, we are looking forward to their fulfillment at a future time. So the Revelation 19 hasn't happened yet. It's talking about Christ coming back, achieving victory and conquering the world. Revelation 20 hasn't happened yet. Satan hasn't been bound yet. He will be bound in the future. Revelation 21, 22 talk about the establishment of the new heavens and new earth. That hasn't happened yet. All of those things, a futurist would say, are being talked about as a prophecy of what we can expect in the future. So most, if not all, a large portion of Revelation is futurist prophecy according to that viewpoint. And then kind of a hybrid between Preterism and futurism would be a view that's called historicist, and that's not very common today. It's not super popular, but it's basically a hybrid, and it's a belief that Revelation outlines a chronological sequence of history. And there are, again, variations within this historically, but for example, the Reformers were actually very much historicist, and they would believe that the popes were the Antichrist. And so there might be different manifestations of what Revelation is talking about. And so history is cyclical and it fulfills the prophecies of Revelation in cycles, kind of. So it's similar to preterist and futurist. It's kind of like a hybrid in the sense that it views kind of recapitulation of history, the cycles of history in some regard, and it fulfills different patterns. So again, not as many people hold to that viewpoint today, so we're not going to talk about it too much. On the other hand, what often fits with the amillennial interpretation, and again, it's not isolated to that, would be what's known as the idealist interpretation. So the idealist interpretation is the belief that Revelation symbolizes an ongoing struggle between good and evil, and so many of the details of Revelation are symbolic or emblematic of that struggle. And so the benefit of an idealist kind of interpretation, which has a lot of historied support in the church, okay? Because a lot of people have been influenced through, maybe you've heard the idea of allegorical interpretation, things like that. So a lot of people embraced that throughout church history because you can see how, okay, Revelation has a lot to teach us then in the struggle of good and evil, and there's always going to be a fight, but God ultimately wins. There's a lot of benefit that people could derive from that if that's the way that Revelation is to be understood. And so, you take those four views, the preterist, futurist, historicist, and idealist. The three most common would be the preterist, futurist, and idealist. And that's usually associated with those three viewpoints. Is usually the postmillennialist has to be preterist because Revelation needs to have already taken place. Now, I suppose it is possible for a postmillennialist to be idealist. I think that that's possible. But the difficulty is that Revelation does seem to have connections to the Olivet Discourse. And so that's why a lot of preterists will basically go hand in hand with Revelation and Matthew 24 and 25 and try to interpret those the same way. The idealist fits well with the amillennial interpretation and the comfort of spiritualizing things a little bit more. And then a futurist fits well with premillennialism because premillennialists tend to interpret Scripture more literally and straightforward and say, hey, if this is what it says will happen, then this is what we should expect will happen, etc. And so that's typical. These interpretive approaches to Revelation are often correlated very nicely with those eschatological approaches. And so when we talk about this, what I want to do is talk about, prophecy with regard to the preterist versus futurist interpretation specifically. And when we're talking about the dating of Revelation, I want to really make a point here that if you say that Revelation is prophecy, whether past or future, then the date of the book actually does matter. Because de facto, we as Christians are very much against the prophecy after the fact. In other words, to write a book claiming that it's prophecy about something that has already taken place in the past, that's disingenuous, dishonest, and basically a false testimony of God's glory and honor. Because the whole point of prophecy, as we find in the Old Testament prophets, is God says what will come to pass in order to glorify himself and show people that it was him that did it. So God is the one who accomplishes those things. He is the one who has done it. And so when prophecy is given, it's not just for the sake of, the people themselves, but it's ultimately for God's glory. Okay, saying this is what's going to take place and my reputation is at stake. But if God prophesies something that has already taken place, that's really ridiculous and doesn't fit the pattern of biblical prophecy or the purpose of biblical prophecy at all. So what that means then is the preterist approach basically has their back against the wall. And that's not necessarily a negative critique. The point is they even acknowledge that if Revelation is written after 70 AD, that basically disqualifies the preterist approach. And what that means is that we ought to take this issue very seriously because it's not just an academic issue. There are some books of the Bible where, okay, maybe it's 605 BC that it's written, maybe it's 607 BC that's written. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it's 700 BC. It doesn't really impact the interpretation of the book very significantly. But for Revelation and the idea of prophecy, it actually does matter. And the whole viewpoint of preterism does implode if Revelation is written after 70 AD. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to kind of talk about how we should think through this issue. And I want to talk about two kinds of evidence which are used in biblical studies to talk about the dates of the books of the Bible and even into textual criticism, but we won't get too much into that. That's the idea of external and internal evidence. Okay, so internal evidence, as the name implies, comes from inside the biblical book itself. So that would be things like language and style. For example, one of the things that's well known about Old Testament books is when you get into some of the later books that happen after the exile, there are some grammatical differences in how Hebrew constructions work, which show up later, showing that these books were written later. Okay, so things like Malachi and Chronicles have different grammatical, even spellings to a certain degree. So you have some difference in spellings, you have some difference in grammar, and that shows, hey, these books were written later as Hebrew has undergone development over time, right? So that would be an example of internal evidence, language and style, showing, oh, this time period is most likely the background for this. Now, you can also have historical references within the book. You have, for example, in Revelation, Revelation 1:9, you have a historical reference with John and the island of Patmos. Okay, so John is at the island of Patmos. That's what the book says. So then we know, okay, internally, that's what we would look for in historical sources about something to verify from the internal evidence what we could maybe date on the outside, right? You also have cross-references. So what I mean by that is you could have within the text Revelation alluding to a lot of the Old Testament. So, for example, if Revelation is quoting Daniel, well, that's automatically evidence, right, that Daniel was written prior to Revelation, right? Obviously. I mean, that's an easy example, but it just shows us relative dating is helpful for internal evidence, seeing the citation of Scripture, cross-referencing, etc. And to a certain degree, you could even throw in theological development here. And we need to be careful with this, though, because in some sense, people get this wrong, but theological development does exist. So, for example, progressive revelation is a real thing. So you're not going to have, for example, you're not going to find Jesus's name in Genesis. Okay. Now, some of you might think you will, but you would expect things to be progressively revealed over time. And that just makes sense. I think we intuitively know that. But you can get carried away with that, and you can misunderstand that. Some liberals, for example, will look at things like Genesis 4, and they'll see the offerings of Cain and Abel. And they'll say things like, well, we know that sacrifice and offerings have to develop, and early on in human history, you can't have such a involved sacrificial system that Cain and Abel were demonstrating. So we know that these are written later. And so obviously that's incorrect, but it's incorrect because of the presupposition of an advanced theological sacrificial system cannot exist early. But that is a part of the internal evidence war, and it's really an example of how internal evidence is so subjective with regard to interpretation that way. But that's internal evidence. You're trying to get details from within the text, and you're trying to interpret them, you're trying to apply them and work through that. And that's a valid, important part of the process. The other side of the process would be external evidence. And this is obviously, as the name implies, going from outside of the text, right? So you're looking at things like manuscript evidence. So for example, if a book has manuscript evidence of existing at a certain time period, you know that the book was written prior to that time period, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious. For example, I will say there are a lot of really cool Old Testament examples for this, but in Isaiah, for example, there was always these liberal theories that Isaiah should be broken up into 2 or 3 books because of some of the subject changes. But then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the mid-1900s, you had, the Great Isaiah Scroll, and what you found was that the entirety of Isaiah was found in this scroll, which dated, to 100, possibly 200 years prior to Christ. And so what that meant is that the oldest piece of evidence we have is that the book of Isaiah was still unified. And so it really causes problems for somebody to be arguing, saying, okay, well, we should understand the book of Isaiah this way as a division of 3, when the evidence that we have says that prior to 100 or 200 BC, it was still a unity. And so it's important then, manuscript evidence helps us date things if we have manuscript evidence. So, for example, a lot of the New Testament books have 2nd and 3rd century manuscripts that we can say, okay, based on the papyri that we found here that has a New Testament document, we know that the book had to have been written prior to this, right? So that's just part of the process, manuscript evidence. You also have quotations in other texts. So it's kind of the reverse of what we were talking about with internal evidence, is that if we see early writers or authors referencing or quoting a biblical text, then we know it must have been written before their time. So if Polycarp or Irenaeus is quoting Revelation or alluding to Revelation, we know that it was obviously written prior to their time because they had access to it, right? So again, that just gives us a really helpful external validation of dating a book that way. We also have archaeological findings, so that can be inscriptions, artifacts, other archaeological data. For example, Pontius Pilate, Gaius, a lot of characters in the New Testament have inscriptional evidence, and we can, even compare records. In the Old Testament, that happens all the time too, with the Assyrian records, the Babylonian records. Sometimes we can compare their data to what we see in the biblical text. In fact, that's one of the main reasons we can date a lot of the biblical kings, is because in the Bible, it tells us, so-and-so reigned 40 years and then went to battle against this king. And then we compare it to the Assyrian records and say, oh, this battle took place in this year. And so now we know what year is applicable in the Old Testament world, and then we can cross-reference that data. But we're using external evidence to effectively date events in the Bible. And that's, based on archaeology, and that can be a very, very helpful tool in doing that. We also have access to historical records, where, very similar to the idea of archaeological finds, is you're finding texts or events mentioned in other historical records, and you're comparing and contrasting those. Now, obviously, the historical record could be wrong, right? And Scripture is not going to be wrong. That's our presupposition of inerrancy. But if the historical record is correct in how it talks, then it provides authentication for when something is taking place and how we should understand that in context. So external and internal evidence are both very important. Now, I want to give a couple foundational principles going forward, how we should think through these kinds of issues in dating. Doesn't this kind of feel like a seminary class? Well, it should feel like a seminary class. I don't know. I think this is really important. So I'm trying to walk us through step by step how we should methodologically think through these things, and then, work with that information as we proceed onward. But foundational principles for working through evidence, we have to know what we're looking for and what the dangers are. And the first thing that people are, I think, prone to mistake is that internal and external evidence have to work together. They have to be cohesive. and they can't be in contradiction. So if you have a contradiction between internal and external evidence, something is wrong. Either the external evidence is wrong or the internal evidence is wrong. Your understanding of the internal evidence, right? And that so when we're going for a viewpoint, we want cohesion between the internal and external evidence. I mean, that should be obvious, but I think it's important to state the obvious, because if you don't know what you're shooting for, you want a date or a theory that makes sense of both external and internal evidence. Hopefully that's obvious to people. Now, the second thing to remember too, and this is where I think it will really, really impact our discussion of the date of revelation, because this is where already people are going to get upset with me, what I'm about to say, is that internal evidence is especially subjective. Okay? I know. What can I say? And the reason people are going to get upset is because a preterist understanding of Revelation dating the book early relies heavily on internal evidence. But let's just think objectively about this, okay? You have to think objectively. It is, without doubt, internal evidence is way more subjective than external evidence, okay? Now, I could give you a bunch of examples. From the Old Testament, for example, you have Deuteronomy. Old Testament scholars are replete and renowned for dating Deuteronomy very late. They don't want to say that Moses wrote it. Why? Because of all the internal factors, and it's their understanding of the internal factors, right? So things like this, a very highly developed religious system of sacrifices and offerings, a very specific set of laws on what Israel should do when they have a king, what that king should look like, Deuteronomy 17. Well, that makes no sense, if you're just, trying to think about it. That makes no sense if there's no king in Israel, right? I mean, why? And I've actually had this discussion in Old Testament classes, is people say, no, God didn't want Israel to have a king. I say, well, listen, check Deuteronomy 17. Why did God give a law governing Israel's king and say, this is what your king needs to do? And then a lot of times people see that maybe for the first time and they say, oh, wait a second. What? God did want a king in Israel and it wasn't him? Like, I don't understand. Well, the point is that our preconceived notions, our presuppositions often influence our interpretation of internal evidence. And so we need to be very, very careful about that. And listen, that's true for everybody, right? It's true for everybody. And so that's why internal evidence is valuable, but it's dangerous. Now, let's give an example that is near and dear to our hearts, and we'll probably have to talk about this more in a future episode. But just think about when people are dating the book of Revelation, the argument that's always thrown out is Revelation 11 talks about measuring the temple. Therefore, the temple has to be standing. Like that's, I don't know how many times I've seen that on forums and, the multi-Twitterverse, which is now X, whatever. So many people are putting those kinds of arguments out. I say, listen, it's ridiculous that somebody would be measuring the temple if it wasn't there. That'd just be the most ridiculous thing in the world. Now, the strength of that argument is only as strong as one's already held preconceived notions, right? And the reason we know that for sure is because we can just ask, okay, is there any other time in Scripture where somebody measures a temple that does not exist? Yes, there are, right? Ezekiel 40:48 is, just right there, ready to jump out at you and scream. And, people forget those kinds of things. They say, well, listen, you can't have that. Or maybe they'll beg the question and say, well, Ezekiel 40:48 is different or something like that. Well, listen, there's a lot more similarities between Ezekiel 40:48 and Revelation 11 than you would actually think. But the reality is that, again, it's just the preconceived notion. If you say that what John has to be doing in Revelation 11 is talking about the measuring of a real temple, and he can't be measuring a temple in a vision or anything like that, then you've already made up your mind on internal evidence, and you've already subjectively decided an interpretation of that, right? And so all I'm saying, and by the way, he could be measuring a real temple. That's something we need to think about. But are there alternative understandings of Revelation 11 that will coincide with all of the evidence, not just with our preconceived notion of what that should mean, right? Okay, so again, just I think really clearly, there are scriptural examples, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Haggai, talking about temples that do not exist, right? And so we just need to understand that. And Revelation 11 could be in the theme of all those other prophets. And so we we need to, again, remember, subjectivity is very present in internal evidence. Now, thirdly, I would say with regard to external evidence, that its main problem or its main difficulty is its availability. Okay, so external evidence, the difficulty is that it's often not very available, or there's limited access to it. One of the things about archaeology is just, if you ever get into archaeology and you understand, the historical records and things like that, is so much is lost in history. I mean, just think about some of these amazing libraries that have been built over time, and then they get burned by conquering armies, and all of that data is lost. So frustrating. But next time you conquer a nation, make sure you do not burn the library. That's all I request. But I would say this, that when you have access to data, and the more data you have access to externally, the more powerful external evidence is. Okay? So let me say that again, just to be clear, is that the more external data you have, the more powerful it is. Okay? Because you have continuing veracity with that. Okay? I think that should go without saying, but again, we want to be very careful. And external evidence is inherently more objective than internal evidence. Now, it can be wrong. We've talked about that. But external evidence often, now, there are exceptions to this, obviously, but most often, in many of the cases, external evidence is objective. For example, when, like I talked about with the Assyrian records, it says this battle, the Battle of Carchemish, took place on this day, in this month, in this year, on this day. Okay, that's objective. Now, the record could be wrong. Okay, the record could absolutely be wrong, but it's very objective in how it states things, right? And some of the evidence for example, when we're going to talk about Revelation, a lot of the external evidence is very objective, saying John wrote the book of Revelation during the reign of Domitian, okay? And that would be, the late date, the 95, 96 AD. So that's very objective, right? External verification of when John wrote the book of Revelation. Now, those sources could be wrong, but it doesn't require us to interpret whether or not what they're saying, because it's just very objective, is that they're claiming that this is a data point for our evidence, okay? So that's why external evidence tends to be a lot more objective. Obviously, there are exceptions depending on the evidence. Some archaeological evidence, like pottery, dating of pottery and things like that, that can be a lot more subjective. But external evidence as a whole tends to be a lot more objective. Okay, so with that in mind, all right, you ready to keep going? With that in mind, the external evidence and internal evidence, when we work through this issue in particular, specifically the dating of Revelation, we need to be working with a couple important considerations in mind. I guess we could call these, the prologue of our study into the date of Revelation. These are very important issues that we need to keep in mind. So the first thing is that there are a lot of discussions in this debate or dialogue that are arguments from silence. Okay, so just logically, if you run across an argument from silence, some are stronger than others, but usually they are not good arguments. So arguments from silence are usually not good arguments. They can be utilized. They are arguments, but they are usually weak compared with other arguments. Okay, I think, again, that should go without saying. I mean, this is basic logic class, but it's really only convincing if somebody's already made up their mind. And so it's really important to deal with evidence that's presented. Now, the reason I bring that up is because there are certain arguments from silence, like, for example, the claim that John would have talked about the destruction of the temple had the book been written after the destruction of the temple. And that's a huge assumption, right? I mean, why is it necessary that John would have had to talk about that? I think that is an argument from silence, because there's a lot of reasons why John wouldn't talk about that, and only one of those has to be right? So it is evidence, but again, anybody who's just trying to be a neutral observer and work through these issues, those arguments are not going to have much weight at all, because there are huge arguments from silence which don't really play into the discussion. Second thing, and this is again to my preterist leaning brothers who are on the fence and they're trying to be rational, they're trying to learn and grow. I know there's going to be a lot of people that listen to this or watch this that they're basically just going to tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, and that's fine. I'm used to that. Everyone tells me that on certain episodes. But one thing that I would really challenge you if you're really trying to work through these kinds of issues correctly is, when we talk about Matthew 24 and the Olivet Discourse, especially, that premier passage, the text of all texts for the preterist, where this generation, all these things will happen before this generation passes away, in Matthew 24. Okay, that should not be used to date Revelation. Okay, this should go without saying, but unfortunately it needs to be said. It's a related issue. It's not completely separate, the understanding of the Olivet Discourse. But, what I see so many times is people say, Matthew 24 has to mean this, therefore Revelation has to be dated this way. But listen, that is super irresponsible. Basically, that is how you fill in any kind of doctrinal deviation. That's how it works, is once you latch on to saying this verse has to mean this, therefore every other interpretation or understanding of a text has to bend to my will and with regard to that, that's super, super dangerous. And so remember, again, this is a bit of a difference in hermeneutics, but I think this is how it has to be, is that each text has its own context, and we interpret those passages within those contexts, and then we synthesize everything. We can't just read texts as paradigms over other texts, right? And especially with regard to dating, where you're saying like, okay, based on our understanding of this text in Matthew, then we have to totally ignore all of the additional or new evidence in Revelation. That's just irresponsible. And if you do that, I would just really, really encourage you to, be objective in how you work through this. If you can come to a conclusion with the dating of Revelation independently, great. That's what you need to do. But using Matthew's understanding, saying, okay, we know everything has to be fulfilled in a preterist understanding because Jesus said this generation, well, that's just super irresponsible, okay? So don't use one verse as a paradigm through which you read the entire scripture then, okay? That would be, very irresponsible and problematic. So those are the, important prologue considerations that I just really encourage people to work through and understand those things. Now, as you've been waiting your whole life for this, let's talk about some of the actual evidence, okay? There are two major aspects of external evidence that we need to consider when we're dating the book of Revelation, okay? And we won't have time in this video, in this podcast, to go over the internal evidence, although we will. I want to do some series and discussions just for the benefit of others who are trying to study these issues. But really what I want to do is start with external evidence because I think it's helpful to break it up in external, internal evidence. And again, if we can find a viewpoint that effectively corroborates the external and internal, then that's great. But I do think external is often it's a necessary starting point because of its objectivity, and we can totally reject the external evidence. I think that's okay. If it's wrong, we reject it. But external is helpful to give us a perspective on when the dating possibilities are. Okay, and so there are two crucial aspects of the external evidence that I want to put forward, and really, I don't want to be super clickbaitish, but it's kind of shocking when you study this, just how lopsided the external evidence is. Okay, so the first aspect of the external evidence is that the majority of the church throughout history has held to the Domitian date of Revelation. I'm going to put up on the screen here, for those of you who are watching, a chart here from a dissertation by Mark Hitchcock. It was a 2005 dissertation entitled "A Defense of the Domitianic Date of Revelation." And some of you who are avid listeners have already read through his dissertation. You know it's very high quality material. And I think it's pretty accessible if you just search for it, maybe by PDF or something like that. I'm pretty sure it's pretty accessible online. And so he's done a lot of really good research into this. And so this is basically reduplication of a chart that he has in his dissertation, but I'm going to read through it for those of you who are listening. And he organizes it on the left side, the witnesses for the late date, and on the right side, the witnesses for the Nero date, the early date. And so on the left date, these are basically explicit witnesses to the late date of Revelation. So you have Irenaeus around 180 AD, Victorinus around 300, Eusebius 300, Jerome 400, Sulpicius Severus around 400, Primasius around 540, Isidore of Seville around 600, the Acts of John 650, Orosius around 600, Andreas around 600, Venerable Bede around 700. So all those are witnesses for the Domitian date of 95-96. And so he talks about each of those in his dissertation. So if you're interested, you can find more of that. I'll quote just a few of them in a moment. But on the other side, witnesses for Nero's date, which, again, we're talking about 64 to 67, there is explicit witness in the Syriac witnesses of the 6th and 7th centuries. So again, on the left side, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7, very, strongly attested, explicit witnesses of John writing during Domitian's reign. But on the Nero side of things, the early date, the first explicit witness comes from the Syriac in the 6th and the Syriac translation in the 6th and 7th centuries. And then you have Aretas in 900 AD, and then Theophylact in 1107. He died, so somewhere before then. And so just that brief assessment there shows that, and by the way, it's funny, I was reading a few commentaries in preparation. I was actually trying to do a little more preparation for this episode than I normally do. I don't know what that means. I just really wanted to make sure, I was, not missing anything and trying to be as thorough as possible. And when I was reading some of the commentaries, it was really interesting as people were talking about the date of Revelation. One of the things that was brought forward is that even people who disagreed with the late date of Revelation acknowledged and this is the word that was used, the unanimous church tradition of a late date of Revelation. Okay? So again, I would say it is essentially unanimous because we always want to leave room for alternative viewpoints. And the correct way to say it is that we view all the evidence that we have access to indicates this, because, there's always evidence that we don't have access to. So out of all the evidence we have access to, this was the viewpoint of the early church, and there was no alternative. Okay, so for the first, we're talking for the first 5 centuries of the church. So for 500 years, double the length of the United States' existence. This was the view of the church. Now, I'm going to read a section from Hitchcock's dissertation here because he talks about this. He says, placing the evidence side by side, the first clear, accepted, unambiguous witness to the Neronic date is a one-line superscription in 2 Syriac versions of the New Testament in the 6th and 7th centuries. If the Neronic date were the original date of Revelation, one would expect a witness to this fact in Asia Minor, where the book of Revelation originated, and a witness much earlier than the 6th century. There are only 2 other unambiguous external witnesses to the early date, Aretas, 900, and Theophylact, 1107. The only time in church history that the early date was the majority view was a brief period at the end of the 19th century, and the common date assigned to Revelation at that time was AD 68-69, after the death of Nero. The late date, on the other hand, has a solid line of support from some of the greatest, most reliable names in church history, beginning in AD 180, Irenaeus, Victorinus, Eusebius, Jerome, Sulpicius Severus, Orosius, Primasius, Venerable Bede, Isidore of Seville, Andreas, Prochorus, the Acts of John. These witnesses came from different and widespread geographical regions of the church. They are heresiologists, apologists, historians, commentators. Irenaeus was from Asia Minor, where the Apocalypse first circulated and was linked to the Apostle John through Polycarp. Victorinus authored the oldest extant Latin commentary on Revelation. Primasius wrote the second oldest extant Latin commentary. Eusebius has been dubbed the father of church history. He had an extensive library at his disposal. Jerome was a recognized giant of the early church. All right, so notice what he's saying is that he's comparing the two, and this is what I mean when I say that the majority of the church throughout history is held to the Domitian date of Revelation, is that he's going through this list of individuals, and these aren't just no name, no sources. These are, the top dogs, as it were, with regard to the sources that we have. So it's not as if we're just finding random, archaeological evidence, which we can say, oh, this could go either way. I mean, these, as I'll show you some of the quotes, they are flat out saying this is when Revelation was written. And Irenaeus, of course, this is something that we need to mention periodically, is the importance of Irenaeus as a witness to the book of Revelation is because of his interaction, his relationship to John through Polycarp. So what we know from church history, again, this is just a well-known fact, is that the Apostle John discipled Polycarp. Polycarp, one of the early church fathers, sat at the Apostle John's feet. And he learned from the Apostle John, so much. In fact, that's why Polycarp was a premillennialist, I believe. Polycarp was 100% a premillennialist. Everybody acknowledges that. It's really kind of odd that he would be learning from the author of Revelation and mess up his eschatology. I mean, it's always possible. He's not inerrant. He's not inspired. But that is a pretty significant piece of evidence that people, often downplay. Regardless, Polycarp and Irenaeus had a direct connection. And so, again, you can see, okay, Irenaeus isn't just a nobody. He actually knew a disciple of John. And so, again, it's unlikely that he would make a mistake. And again, being from Asia Minor, where this is taking place, we would presumably trust his witness on that. And we're going to look at Irenaeus' statement in just a minute. Now, Philip Schaff, who has written a lot on the history of the Christian church, obviously one of the most well-known histories there, he is himself actually a early date proponent of Revelation. But he says this in his commentary on the history of the Christian church. He says, the prevailing, we may say the only distinct tradition, beginning with so respectable a witness as Irenaeus about 170, assigns the exile to the end of the reign of Domitian, who ruled from 81 AD to 96 AD. So what Schaff is saying, and again, he doesn't, which is ironic, isn't it? Basically, he's saying that in not holding to a late date of Revelation himself, he's saying we still recognize that this was the only tradition of the church for so long. Okay, so we don't, and I'm fine with saying we don't hold tradition above the biblical text, right? We definitely hold the biblical text as being more authoritative and truthful, right? But we're not talking about just like one random point. There is a lot of evidence here, right? Now, when we think of the sequence of this, though, we've been talking about the entirety of church history here. As Hitchcock says in his dissertation, there was actually a brief period of time where the pre-70 AD viewpoint was the dominant position, or at least it seemed to be, and that was 1850 to about 1900. And so these proponents dated the apocalypse to about 68 or 69 AD, which, by the way, would be too late for Kenneth Gentry's viewpoint. Remember, if it's going to be talking about the death of Nero and it's going to be talking about the initiation of Nero's persecution, it has to be 64 to 67, somewhere in there. But a lot of these pre-70 AD adherents dated it to 68 or 69 AD. So that doesn't work with the typical modern preterist understanding put forward by Gentry. So that's just a side note, but we can acknowledge that there were a lot of people who put it prior to the destruction of Jerusalem between 1850 and 1900. Now, the question is, why was there a shift during that period of time? I don't think we can be certain, but I'm just going to give you some thoughts that I think are helpful to understand. Again, I don't think there's been a return since that time. Obviously, it's still the primary position among commentators. Most In fact, I had a student and friend who was going through some of the Revelation commentaries for me just because I didn't want to miss that, and he was just cataloging what they all thought about the dates of the Revelation, just so I could have some confidence. And I thought about putting the chart up for you guys, but I'm too lazy. So you could do it yourself. You could just research, but it's basically a standard fact. Everyone acknowledges that the majority of commentators today would take a late date of Revelation based on all the evidence. But why was there a shift between the 1850s and 1900s? There's probably a couple reasons, but one thing that is kind of, I think, not thought about a lot is really the emergence of critical theory during that time period. So critical methodologies, really had an impact. I mean, think about what we've seen in our culture because of critical theory, the deconstruction of gender, the deconstruction of marriage and family, whatever. Well, critical theories and methodologies, now it's slightly different in biblical studies, but they actually come from similar constructs. But critical methodologies gained steam in biblical studies in the 19th century. And part of critical methodology is basically as part of the postmodern ideology, kind of the initial idea of postmodernism and how that worked is you would have a doubting of what the Bible claims, okay, and a doubting of what authority had said is true, okay? So now that can be good to a certain degree, where you don't just accept things because somebody says it's true, but you're willing to challenge it and test it for yourself, okay? That can be good. But what also happens is that you have people trying to come up with novel theories, and you have people pushing. And listen, I sense that in my own life, if I'm honest with you, is that it's really attractive to buck the main interpretation of a passage and say, no, I'm going to go with the minority interpretation here because I think that's more daring, and it shows the authorities and the main commentaries that they don't know what they're talking about or whatever, okay? So there is something to be said about that, and I think that makes it into biblical studies. Okay, so we really need to be careful with that. And I think that actually plays a part into it, as you have, some main interpreters during that time who are, embracing, those kinds of teachings and methodologies in the critical world. And so they, deconstruct the authority, as it were, and they embrace that. So it's possible that is influencing, that time period. It's also interesting because, I mean, this is kind of a side note, but I think it's really interesting, and it plays into this, is that at that time, there were lots of developments and doctrines that were in play. In fact, I listened to an episode by Jim Renahan in his podcast, Theology in Particular, which is a particular Baptist confessional podcast, which, I mean, I love Jim Renahan. I don't think he knows I exist, but I really enjoy listening to him. And one of the things that he talked about was that in the mid 1800s, you had all these crazy developments. And I wonder if he would say that there's a connection to kind of the whole emergence of critical theory and things like that at all. But, you have, for example, you have the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Millerites, and, you kind of have this eschatological fervor or craziness that's taking place during that time. And it's interesting to think about that because, I wonder, again, this is just theorizing, but I wonder if, there was a response to that kind of craziness, that eschatological craziness by the Millerites and the Seventh-day Adventists and others who were embracing this kind of crazy, oh, Christ could come back now, and saying, well, wait a second, Revelation doesn't say that Christ will come back. We need to talk about, that as already having taken place. I don't know. But if that's true, there could be some parallels with today, because there's definitely a lot of people jumping on the preterism / post-mill bandwagon just because they're sick of all of the, so-called rapture fever that they've been, fed through Hollywood and all these books, bestseller novels, Left Behind series, things like that. And so people get sick of that kind of thing. And so they jump to kind of the opposite thing. And so I wonder if that's, in play. I don't know, but that's just conjecture in some point. But the big point to take away from all that is that it is 100% true that, the majority of the church for all time has been dating the book of Revelation late during the reign of Domitian. Okay, now let's look at the second, and this is the I guess in one way the most important. Looking at the second part of this is not just that the majority of witnesses throughout church history have embraced this, but the earliest and best of our external evidence clearly supports the Domitian date. Now, that's in one sense obvious if the majority is always doing that, but here's why I make a distinction, because in textual criticism, for example, in trying to discern what the text of the New Testament or the Old Testament is, it's not enough just to say the majority of the manuscripts we have this reading, therefore let's use that. Okay, there are actually plenty of places where the majority of the manuscripts we have are not what our Bibles read. And that's because we weight the earlier witnesses more favorably, or with greater ethos, or with greater power, as it were. We understand that it's not just a number issue, it's also a weighting issue. And so in a situation like this, the earliest evidence we have is quite valuable, okay? Now, again, it's not inerrant. We're not talking about that, but we're just, like in a courtroom, we're evaluating the evidence, right? And so we want to objectively come to this and say, yes, the earliest evidence we have is actually quite valuable. And there's a few that I want to bring up as far as the early evidence that supports the Domitian date, the 95-96 AD date. The first one, which is actually often minimized in the discussion, is an individual by the name of Hegesippus or Hegesippus. I'm not sure what the foregoing pronunciation of his name is. But Hegesippus lived from about 120 to 190 AD, so he was essentially a contemporary, just a little earlier than Irenaeus. And he is important because people assume that Irenaeus is the only one that has the discussion of the Domitian date early, and everyone just copies him. But it seems as if Hegesippus is the one who really informs Eusebius, the great father of church history, gives Eusebius a lot of his information on this. Okay, so the thing about Hegesippus is that he wrote his main work is called Memoirs. It's about 5 treatises, and Eusebius used them a lot. Okay, so I'm going to bring up here on the screen some of these references just because I want you to see them, and I'm obviously going to be reading them. But in Eusebius's church history, his third book, we see all throughout this section that he's relying on Hegesippus. So, for example, in his church history work, book 3, we're looking at chapter 11 here, and then this is the second verse, if that's how we say it. And the second verse, he talks about they were all of one consent. They pronounced Simeon, the son of Clopas, of whom the gospel also makes mention to be worthy of the episcopal throne of that parish. So he's talking about Simeon being made the episcopal bishop. And so he was a cousin, as they say, of the Savior. And then this is his explanation here, for Hegesippus records that Clopas was a brother of Joseph. All right? So there you have Hegesippus being a main source for some of the details that Eusebius is getting. Now you go down a few lines as he's talking about things, and this is just a little bit lower in the third book, and this is chapter 16. And in chapter 16, it's talking about the epistle of Clement, okay? So it says, there is an extant epistle of Clement, which is acknowledged to be genuine and is of considerable and remarkable merit. It says he wrote it in the name of the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth when a sedition had arisen in the latter church. We know that that this epistle also has been publicly used in a great many churches, both in former times and in our own, and of the fact that a sedition did take place in the Church of Corinth at the time referred to, Hegesippus is a trustworthy witness. Okay, so again, you have Eusebius relying on Hegesippus to date these things. Okay, now when you get to chapter 18, that's the one that everyone knows because Eusebius there quotes Irenaeus with regard to the dating of the book of Revelation. We'll look at that in just a moment. But as the thing that I want to point out, because Hitchcock mentions this in his dissertation. I think it's a really important observation, is that Eusebius is recording events that have been taking place. So at the end of chapter 17, he says, he was in fact the second that stirred up persecution against us, although his father Vespasian had undertaken nothing prejudicial to us. But then in verse 1 of chapter 18, the next part, he continues saying, it is said that in this persecution, so it's talking about the persecution of chapter 17. So in other words, he's continuing the story. This section is, it's kind of like in biblical studies. You're like, okay, you have to look at the context. The context is what determines meaning. Well, the same thing is true in all communication. That's why we say it in the Bible. And so with regard to chapter 18, when he says, it is said in this persecution, he's obviously continuing a train of thought that he had been utilizing Hegesippus for, okay? So he's talking about John. So it is said, in other words, some source has delivered to Eusebius the fact that the apostle and evangelist John, this is verse 1, who was still alive, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos in consequence of his testimony to the divine word. So in other words, he's relying on some source. Now, some people might just assume that he's talking about Irenaeus there, but he introduces Irenaeus in verse 2, the next verse, and then quotes him. So it's at least possible, we'll just say it that way, at least possible that he's continuing to rely on Hegesippus. And that seems to be the fact because in chapter 19, right after, we're talking about 18, but then in chapter 19, it says, when this same Domitian had commanded that the descendants of David should be slain, an ancient tradition says that some of the heretics brought accusation against the descendants of Jude, said to have the brother of the Savior according to the flesh, on the ground that they were the lineage of David and were related to Christ himself. Hegesippus relates these facts in the following words. So in other words, in chapter 19, he continues to talk about Domitian's activity and says Hegesippus is the one who talks about these things. And so again, we are not stating that this is the clearest external evidence. This is those kind of evidence where it's more subjective, because it could be that Eusebius in chapter 18, when he's talking about Domitian sending John into exile, he's only relying on Irenaeus. That could be the interpretation. But it seems more likely, I think, given just the prevalence of reliance on Hegesippus throughout, and the continuation. So Irenaeus is introduced in verse 2. So who is he relying on in verse 1? It seems like, based on the fact that this entire section is very heavily reliant on Hegesippus, that would be a natural understanding. The problem is we don't have his works, right? So that's why Eusebius had them before him, and he was reading from them. But we do not have his works. So that's the unfortunate thing. Maybe one day we'll find them, and we'll have even more external evidence that John wrote during the reign of Domitian. But until that time, we are playing a little bit of interpretation game, understanding how Eusebius is using his sources, right? But I think it's a fair discussion to have. So when we think of that, I would say it's possible that John's relationship to the island of Patmos being sent to exile under Domitian, which would happen in 95, 96 AD, that is being recorded by Hegesippus, who then is being relied upon by Eusebius. Okay, now it's, I guess, the thing that is objective there, that we 100% would agree with, is that Hegesippus is the source for all the surrounding sections of what Eusebius is talking about, because he lists him as the main source there. And it would be strange if Hegesippus is talking about all these things that Domitian does, that he doesn't talk about the banishment of John to Patmos, when in verse 1 Eusebius actually says this is what is talked about or related, meaning I'm not just saying this is what is delivered according to tradition. Okay, so that's how we put those things together. I'm not sold saying that has to be your only argument. I'm just saying that I think that a lot of times people only think Irenaeus is the one who talks about this, but I think there are other sources as well, and Eusebius seems to indicate Hegesippus is one of those. But needless to say, Irenaeus is definitely our most important witness, and so we go back to that chapter 18 now. Now, Irenaeus, again, I've said this before, but we just need to remind ourselves he's related to John through Polycarp, right? So this direct connection to Polycarp, who knew the author of Revelation, very, very strong. It's often downplayed. It's often says, well, that doesn't really matter. I mean, come on, that matters. It'd be, like trying to downplay somebody who, like if I had a relationship with, I'm just thinking about how I've known people, had good relationships with people who knew John MacArthur really well, for example. Like I remember one particular pastor who was very, very close to John MacArthur, and I was very, very close to this pastor. And that was such a great relationship because oftentimes I'd just say, well, what would MacArthur say about that? And we'd talk about it sometimes and whatever. And, so you can't tell me that knowing somebody who knew John the Apostle would not be valuable. Are you kidding me? Come on. All right. So now Irenaeus wrote in Greek, but only his Latin commentaries remain. But Eusebius actually preserves the Greek quotation. So bringing back chapter 18 here now. So this is Eusebius. He says, Irenaeus in the 5th book of his work against heresies, where he discusses the number of the name of Antichrist, which is given in the so-called Apocalypse of John, speaks as follows concerning him. And then this is the quote in verse 3. If it were necessary for his name to be proclaimed openly at the present time, it would have been declared by him who saw the revelation, for it was seen not long ago, but almost in our generation, our own generation, at the end of the reign of Domitian. So in other words, what he's saying is that the revelation, the apocalypse, was seen by John almost in our own generation at the end of the reign of Domitian. Okay, so again, Domitian, 95, 96 AD, that's 96 AD is the end of his reign. So that would make sense. That would make perfect sense with what Irenaeus is saying here. Okay. Now, this is not an ambiguous statement. Some people say, oh, it's ambiguous. It could be saying that we saw John near the end of the reign of Domitian. But, it's, I think in Hitchcock's dissertation, one of the phrases he says is that necessity is the mother of invention, meaning that, this is often said to be ambiguous because obviously preterism needs this to be false, right? Remember, that's what I mean with having their backs against the wall. You need Irenaeus to be wrong here, because if what he's saying is true, because he's just saying, like, listen, John saw the revelation, it was seen at the end of Domitian's reign. If that's true, then preterism is false, okay, just flat out. And that's the problem. And so you have to try to say, oh, maybe it's ambiguous. Maybe he's saying that it wasn't the revelation that was seen at the end of Domitian's reign. It was John himself that was seen. But that's really kind of ridiculous. On the one hand, this is actually kind of funny. On the one hand, to say that it's that ambiguous is strange because nobody took it that way in the early church. If they are reliant upon Irenaeus, as is often argued, if they're reliant on Irenaeus, then nobody took it that way. They all took it as if it was the book of Revelation that was written during Domitian's reign. So that's one thing. But then second of all, it's also the nearest antecedent to the verb is the apocalypse itself. So that would be the most natural, normal way to communicate. It's just that it's inconvenient for somebody who wants Revelation to be written earlier, that you have to make Irenaeus say something else or that. Now, because Irenaeus is so clear on this and he's so early and he's so valuable, obviously there are a lot of people who are trying to, bring some, cast dispersions upon the character of our good man Irenaeus. So one of the things that they'll do to cast this, shadow on Irenaeus is they'll say, well, Irenaeus is untrustworthy because he often argued that Jesus was 40 years old. And we know Jesus wasn't 40 years old when he died. He was, 30, 33 years old or whatever. and 37, somewhere around there. But he wasn't 40 plus years old. That's ridiculous. And so we know Irenaeus doesn't have his facts straight or whatever. But in the context, it's true that Irenaeus did believe that Jesus was 40 years old when he died. But in context, the reason he believed that was because his understanding of John 8, where the Jews go to Jesus and say, "You're not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham," that kind of thing. And so Irenaeus said, well, that just shows that he must have been in his 40s, because the Jews said, "You're not yet 50 years old," so he must have been 40. So what's interesting there, though, is that actually also kind of illustrates, now obviously I think Irenaeus was wrong there, okay? I think there's other reasons that the Jews could say you're not yet 50 years old. But Irenaeus interpreted scripture one way and said, okay, that's what this has to mean. So that's a really good example of where internal evidence can be subjective, and Irenaeus got the internal evidence wrong, and his interpretation of scripture is wrong. But that's a lot different than why you're dealing with objective facts, right? So that's different than him saying, hey, Polycarp, John through Polycarp, let me know that this is when Revelation was written or whatever. And so I think that that's different, and so, yeah, we don't say that Irenaeus is infallible. It's not like every interpretation of every scripture passage that he has is correct. I mean, he is a fallible human being, to be sure. But I think that that's the idea that he thought Jesus was 40, and so we can't trust what he says. I mean, that's not really that makes no sense to me, and I don't think we should value that as an opinion. Another way to kind of discredit the value of Irenaeus is a lot of times, because Irenaeus, as you can imagine, is a super valuable trump card in this whole discussion, and so a lot of people say, well, listen, Irenaeus was wrong and everybody just copied him. That's what a lot of people say. In fact, that I think is probably the main response that I've seen online when the universality of church history is brought forward. They say, oh, everyone just copied Irenaeus and he was wrong. We know that. Well, let's think through this just a little bit here, okay? So even if that happened, even if everybody just copied Irenaeus, that doesn't prove that he was wrong, okay? So that in and of itself, you still have to say, like, okay, Irenaeus could be right, and if everybody else copied him, great. But let's say it this way. Hegesippus also seems to be a valid source. Okay, that's implicit, subjective, but that seems to be a reasonable understanding of how Eusebius is using his historical sources. But second of all, with regard to, you think of people who are using Irenaeus, like Eusebius, the great church historian. Well, Eusebius isn't just copying what Irenaeus says. In fact, one of the things about Eusebius, the great church historian, is that he actually doesn't follow Irenaeus. He says, okay, Eusebius actually, doesn't parrot Irenaeus, but he says that it was somebody else who wrote the book of Revelation, that it was, I think he calls him John the Presbyter or John the Elder. In other words, some of these individuals were free thinkers, I guess is the way we could say that. They did not just parrot what Irenaeus was saying. And that's really kind of demeaning to a lot of these people. I mean, just think about people like Jerome. I'll give his quote in a little bit, but Jerome, the great scholar of, Israel, basically, he makes his camp in Bethlehem as he's translating the Latin Vulgate, all of that access that he has to these great libraries. You're really just saying that he's just relying on Irenaeus, or is he really diving into the sources? And I mean, it's really kind of demeaning to say that, yeah, these people are so dumb and stupid, they just rely on one person and they didn't do their own historical research or verify with other sources. I mean, that is very ill-conceived and prejudicial, all right? You're just operating on preconceived notions that way. All we know for sure is that there is basically universality saying that John wrote during the reign of Domitian. That's all we know for sure. And I would say the presupposition is that many of these people, given where they differed with each other on other things, are thinking independently on those things, not just saying, oh, well, Irenaeus says this, therefore I must say this, right? I mean, that seems kind of a weak argument to me. And then lastly, I guess, going back to what we were talking about before, is a lot of people say Irenaeus is ambiguous, but if he is so ambiguous, you can't have it both ways. If people are just parroting him and copying him, saying that John wrote Revelation and Revelation was during the time of Domitian, obviously that's not ambiguous then. If everyone's clearly understanding what Irenaeus is talking about, then we have a problem, right? Because he's not so ambiguous, because everybody is just agreeing and saying the same thing, and they're not confusing the issue, okay? So it's just, I think pointing out those inconsistencies is helpful for people, to say that the arguments against Irenaeus, the arguments against the external evidence, really kind of portray the futility of what's going on here. Is we want to be fair with these things, and we want to be objective. And a lot of these counter arguments that are utilized are not fair. They're not objective. And really, anybody who's trying to be objective and fair can see that. Okay. Now, I want to give just a few more. We've already been going a long time, and I don't want to steal too much of your time, but I think these things are important to talk about, especially with the rise of preterism and people just really kind of downplaying the external evidence. We need to really understand just exactly how strong the external evidence is. So I want to just talk about Victorinus a little bit, and he wrote around 300 AD. So he's the earliest known Latin revelation commentary that we have. It's the oldest extant commentary. So this is what Hitchcock notes in his dissertation about this individual. So he says, in his commentary on the Apocalypse at Revelation 10:11, he notes this. That's Victorinus again. So Victorinus says this. He says this, because when John said these things, he was in the island of Patmos, condemned to the labor of the mines by Caesar Domitian. There, therefore, he saw the apocalypse, and when grown old, he thought that he should at length receive his quittance from suffering. Domitian being killed, all his judgments were discharged, and John being dismissed from the mines, thus subsequently delivered the same apocalypse which he had received from God. And this is the second section. So that was on Revelation 10:11, and now Revelation 17:11. Victorinus says, the time must be understood in which the written apocalypse was published. Since then reigned Caesar Domitian, but before him had been Titus his brother, and Vespasian, Otho, Vitellius, and Galba. These are the five who have fallen. One remains under whom the apocalypse was written, Domitian. So, in other words, very clear, Victorinus believed that Domitian was the Caesar at the time that John received the book of Revelation. And it's interesting, too, because one of the things that I didn't mention, or maybe I mentioned and I forgot, but Eusebius, when he's using Hegesippus does talk about this release from the labor after Domitian dies. And so Eusebius is using Hegesippus for that. So again, another connection where Hegesippus is probably, even though we don't have his source, he's probably talking about these very things as well. So Victorinus, very clearly, very early commentator, believed that it was written under Domitian. Now we've talked a lot about Eusebius. I think it's worth everybody going back and reading Eusebius for themselves. I think he's very clear, but we're not going to go into too much detail for that. But I do want to kind of wrap this up by talking about Jerome here. Now, Jerome really was a giant. I remember when I first started seminary, I didn't know Jerome. I didn't know Jerome, but he's really recognized as one of the most learned men in the Latin-speaking church. He's translating the Bible into Latin. He translates the Latin Vulgate, which becomes the Bible of the church for almost 1,000 years. So just very, very gifted in languages, very gifted scholar, lived in Bethlehem, where he lived for, I think, over 30 years, just working and translating. So he had access to, the different libraries at like Caesarea, and, a variety. I mean, he probably could travel down to Alexandria. He had access to a lot, right? Now, in his book, Lives of Illustrious Men, he writes about John's banishment. So this is his quote, okay? So this is Jerome. Again, no slouch. This is Jerome. So in the 14th year, then after Nero, Domitian, having raised a second persecution, he was banished to the island of Patmos and wrote the Apocalypse, on which Justin Martyr and Irenaeus afterward wrote commentaries. But Domitian, having been put to death and his acts on account of his excessive cruelty having been annulled by the Senate, he returned to Ephesus under Preterism and continuing there until the time of the Emperor Trajan, founded and built churches throughout all Asia, and, worn out by old age, died in the 68th year of our Lord's Passion and was buried near the same city. So Jerome seems to give a lot of details there, right? And Domitian is very clearly identified there as being the emperor during which John the Apostle received the apocalypse and wrote about it. Okay. All right. There's a lot more I could give. Okay. That's just, but I don't want to insult your intelligence. I'll just say it this way, is that the evidence is not ambiguous at all. The external evidence is very, very clear. It's clear, and crazy enough, it's universal. Okay. And it's crazy because you have people from all different geographical locations and all different times holding on to this tradition that John wrote Revelation during the time of Domitian. Okay, now what could be the response to that? I think something is wrong. Now, again, external evidence isn't the only evidence, but something is wrong if the best counter argument you have is just, well, they were all wrong. Okay. Now, I'm not denying that people can be wrong, but we also need to be careful because we don't want to reject a position. We don't want to reject a very clear external source just because, or external tradition, just because it doesn't coincide with our viewpoint. Okay. And remember, the best source we have, Irenaeus himself, is directly connected to John through Polycarp. All right, so let's not deny that either. Okay, so again, that's not saying that he's inerrant, but I'm just saying like it's a direct connection that is such a valuable resource. And so the external evidence is clear and unambiguous. Okay, there's a lot of evidence, but what blows me away, and I think people need to understand this, is that it's the idea with the external evidence is that there's not really two sides. It's not a two-sided issue with regard to the external evidence. It is heavily weighted. I mean, is there even any evidence on the other side? Not until the 6th or 7th century, according to Hitchcock. Now, one of the main things that people bring up in response to this overwhelming external evidence is they say, well, listen, the external evidence may be very weighty on the side of the late date of Revelation, but the internal evidence is just too weighty. The internal evidence is so strong for the early date, the Neronic date of Revelation. And we're going to try to talk about that in future episodes, okay? Because it's not, in my humble opinion. And if we can come up, so two things on that, okay? On the one hand, if it's so weighty, then we shouldn't be able to find an alternative viewpoint. So in other words, remember the priority is if we can get something that matches external and internal evidence, that is always preferred. That is a proper detective-like procedure, right? We want to be good interpreters. We want to be practicing a good, consistent hermeneutic. So if we can find a proper internal interpretation that matches with the external evidence, then we're going to have to do that, okay? We go where the scriptures lead. We go where all the evidence leads. But on the other hand, when people say the internal evidence is so weighty, it outweighs all the external evidence. Think about the huge inconsistency on that issue, okay? The huge inconsistency is that the internal evidence is so weighty, and yet despite the internal evidence being so weighty for an early date, the majority of the early church missed the internal evidence. We're not talking about just like 51% of the church here. We're talking about out of the access of the resources we have, both historical and into modern day. We're talking the vast majority of the church has dated the book of Revelation late. Okay? So if the internal evidence was so weighty and so clear and so obviously pre-70 AD, why is it that so many people missed it? Right? I think that's something we need to consider. And as we go through in future episodes some of the internal evidence, I think it'll be clear that perhaps it's not so weighty toward a 70 AD. position. Okay. Obviously, I know some of you are going to be really upset with me, but I just am trying to be helpful, trying to get some discussions going, and also trying to put forward some evidence that we need to consider in how to think through these issues as well. I know we live in the day and age of the soundbite and the day and age of, let's get the one-line responses going. But we need to think deeply about these things and think methodologically, assess all the evidence, the external evidence, the internal evidence, all of that. So hopefully this helps us do that. If you want a lot more on this issue, I'd heavily encourage you to look up Mark Hitchcock and his dissertation 2005 on the defense of the Domitian date of the Book of Revelation. You can always reach out to me through the contact form on my website, petergaiman.com. You can also check out Shepherd's Theological Seminary, where I teach, at shepherds.edu. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you.